Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Leigh N. Gallagher to our At Home with Literati series in support of Who You Might Be, her debut novel. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase the book from the bookstore throughout the event. Live transcription is available to you if you need it. There's a CC icon on the bottom of your screen, and you can interact with us at any time using the Q&A. Whenever you have a question, please feel free to submit it there in the Q&A box. I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of our conversation this evening. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also subscribe to our channel to be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available there. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area and you feel like interacting with Art Fair, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or later this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. But without further ado, let me introduce tonight's author. Leigh N. Gallagher's work has been published in American Short Fiction, Beloit Fiction Journal, Salt Hill, and the Reading Room Anthology, and in non-traditional formats through collaborations with artists and musicians. She holds an MFA from the University of Michigan, and her writing has received support from many organizations, including the Helen Wurlitzer Foundation of New Mexico, the Vermont Studio Center, the Marble House Project, and the Marble House Project. Originally from California, she lives in Philadelphia. Who You Might Be is her first novel. Please join me in welcoming Leigh N. Gallagher into your living rooms, phone screens, laptop screens. Leigh, my old friend, so great to see you. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our little virtual bookstore.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here.
I thought we might start with a reading, and I think you'll read from the very beginning of the book, which I think is a pretty brilliant way to expose new readers who've yet to pick it up to the novel.
Yeah, I'll just read the first few pages. This section is called Night Ships. Two 14-year-old girls, one beautiful and one just okay, are running away from home on a northbound Amtrak. A Friday in August, California is all dried out, ready to catch fire beneath a bad mood sun. Miniature navy window curtains recall the pressed and pleated skirts girls wear on television, but which Judy and Megan have never worn. They are publicly schooled and more or less poor. A plastic table between them accommodates their homey messes. Seat back veils, dandruff absorbers, wisp up, then lower all by themselves. The girls chew their cuticles and turn their heads fast to remember their ponytails. They scoff at the name of the train line, the Coastal Quest. Courtney is totally mental. Courtney S. or Courtney N? Duh, mental and crazy. She's kind of a mental slut. She kind of has a mustache. I heard she sleeps with a stuffed animal. She probably practices stuff on it. I bet she practices stuff on her dog. Melissa definitely practices stuff on her dog. Ew, her dog's name is Cootie. Ew, more like Coochie. Coochie cooties. Ew. Megan, the pretty one, starts it, but Judy, anxious today, has the compulsion to keep it going. They talk until it's painful, until their subjects are obliterated and the babble blends with the train's manic engine, its determined, rattling charge, though they perform cool indifference. Whatever, who cares? Eye contactless. Megan, as in most things, is better at the act than Judy. Judy has a tendency to slip into earnestness. Is it weird, though, to do a blowjob? How do people breathe? A change in her vocal register, a mix of doubt and hope, wanting to believe what she thinks she believes. If a guy really wants it, you just, like when I did it with that Mexican guy last year at day camp, it's not like I didn't want to, but Megan shakes her head. She's discovered this way of cutting herself off, enviable to Judy, right at the edge of disgrace. Her long fingers are lost in French braiding her thick blonde hair, adroit as weaving spiders. There's a disconnect between them, an imbalance of experience that makes Megan a kind of mentor and Judy an involuntary test taker. In addition to Bacardi, pot cookies, hangovers, and cigarettes, Megan has been through all the bases except the last one and is already armed with descriptions and advice. Finger banging is like a tampon left in too long. If a guy eats a lot of pineapple, his sperm will taste sweeter. While Judy, besides 2 back-to-back Zimas, her own experimental finger, and a parking lot makeout with Jesse M's twin brother, has done almost nothing. She wants to more for the advance of it, the awkward but necessary stepping forward, than for anything like physical pleasure, which she suspects is mostly a myth. Josh B probably dreams of you blowjaying him. Megan holds the finished braid, waiting for a hair tie. Judy is, among other roles, the keeper of the friendship's hair ties. God, barf, Judy says, raising her pelvis to get into her pocket. Last week, Josh called Megan's house to say that he and Jared were going to the pool. Tell Judy to wear her 2-piece, he'd requested, that blue one. And Megan's eyes went huge. Had Judy buzzed with excitement, with something like pride? She had before it bottomed out despondently. When they arrived at the Van Nuys rec park in their bikini tops and shorts, Judy's blue 2-piece was the only suit she had, and waved to the boys in the water. Her stomach swarmed, a hive of anticipation, as Josh, whom she'd spent most of middle school coveting at a distance, emerged from the ladder streaming wet. But his pale skin looked thick as mozzarella, purple back knee splayed across his shoulders, and there was something tumorous and alive about the pouch beneath his belly button. Judy tensed in a different way. He grinned at her, right at her, then trotted over and wagged his head so water sprayed and his hair spiked. Treading in the deep end, Jared called Josh a fucktard for the girls' benefit, which Josh rejoined with a wet armpit fart, a casual mooning. No fear, his board shorts announced on the thighs, wet and clinging as he settled behind Judy and set to rubbing her shoulders. His cold legs gripped her and his hands squeezed and pinched. You're tight, relax, damn girl. Glad you wore this thing, toying with a knot at her neck, pulling not hard enough to untie it, just hard enough to show that he could. Oh my God, you guys get a room, Megan sang. Last year, Josh had been the best skater in school. Judy had drunk in the sight of his body, waiting for his smile when Megan hollered something funny. How had he become repulsive? The change made her feel apart from herself, not today who she had been yesterday. She wanted only to wriggle away from his touch. Obscurely, Rick, her mother's new husband, seemed to be to blame. I don't know, he used to be fine, but something happened, Judy says now, handing over the rubber band. You just don't like guys once they start liking you. What guys, Judy wants to know. Megan is always making a precedent of things that have happened only once. At least Jared is sort of nice. Megan pipes an aria of laughter. Judy and Jared, BLOWING, and looks around to see if any of the other passengers, men in baseball caps, mothers in sandals, children in pajamas, and a homeless-looking couple, are as titillated as she is. The braid, fixed and symmetrical when Megan turns, is a perfect glowing cord, a spinal fairy tale thing, the density of which Judy will never feel on her own head. You're perverted, she says, but something churns in her, that familiar Megan jealousy. Her own hair is unspectacularly brown, cowlicked and staticky, and frizzing at the temples in heat and during rain. The train runs inland just enough that everything is ugly. Withered palms tick by, dead body dumpsters, stock-still pit bulls, the junky rears of strip malls no one is supposed to see. Judy has the backward-facing carnival seat, the one that makes you feel not propelled forward so much as dragged from behind into the future against your will. Simi and Oxnard crackle through the intercom, kiddie pools and broken fences, graffiti on fast forward. It's hardly different from the setting of their lives. They're only 20, 30 miles from home, but everything is tweaked strange by this sudden autonomy, the fear that comes with acting out the illicit, a heart-fluttering sensation like hands let go. Last week, the girls spent a whole afternoon at the 24-hour Kinko's to cut, paste, and ditto serial killer style, old permission slips and various sign-up sheets imprinted with the school logo to make elaborately fake dossiers outlining an elaborately fake 2-night field trip to yonder wild cabins and outdoor center at Lake Arrowhead. They nailed the verisimilitude right down to the mint green paper, used their most adult handwriting to address the envelopes to their own houses, mailed them from the post office nearest Ulysses S. Grant High School, then flung their ripped open contents at their stupid respective mothers. What, Mom, you didn't even know that the 9th grade summer trip was next week? Child neglect, Jesus H. Christ, I need $46 cash. It was exactly the sort of project to fill the late afternoon vacation days when their eyes were numb to the television and their beds gummy with so much shed, sunburnt skin. So pleased were they by their own thorough craftiness that they almost wished Bonnie or Rita would squint into the fine print, detecting something fishy, something off, if only for the chance to make up even more. But neither Bonnie nor Rita were that kind of mother. Do you think they'll figure it out though? Judy asks. What if they're at like Vaughn's and they run into Stephanie or Melissa's mom or Mrs. Lombardi? These worries, vague all along, are solidifying now as she says them. What would her mother think? What, if she discovered Judy missing, would she feel? Megan sighs. She has one hand on a doorstop copy of Stephen King's It, which she's been adamantly opening and closing for so many months. The book has become a kind of permanent, spooky accessory to her otherwise beachy beauty. Yeah, like your mom is going to run into anyone anywhere, Megan says, except maybe the bar. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to relive this again, that opening chapter again through your voice. And whoops. Sorry, I classically knocked out my headphones as I was talking. So to set the stage a bit before my first question, which is sort of about what you've just read, the novel, for those who haven't read it, and to not give too much away, as we've just heard, Judy and Megan are on this sort of illicit train ride, and they're going to meet their new internet friend, Cassie, who they've never met. And when they arrive, they encounter her caretaker, who is her aunt, who's no longer mentally well. Cassie is not there, and they're sort of locked in her room. And they discover her diary. And then we find out a little bit about why Cassie is left too. The second section of the novel takes place not in California, but briefly in California, but then a family moves to Michigan. That family made up of two brothers, Miles, who's adopted, and Caleb. And as Caleb sort of navigates his imperious boredom in Ann Arbor, as an 18-year-old, he discovers Detroit. He discovers its graffiti scene. He brings his brother Miles into that scene as well. And then all of that hurtles towards a traumatic episode. And then the third section, unlike the first two sections, which takes place in the late 90s, the third section marries these two seemingly separate narrative threads in New York in 2016. So we heard from the sort of this opening moment of Judy and Megan on the train to a bad time. Still find out. And my first question, Leigh, is so I was blown away when I first got the advanced copy in the mail. I read the first page and then put the book down, and then immediately walked over to my girlfriend and said, read this first page. Like, this is like the ideal novel first page. Like, this is such an explosive entryway into the novel. And it was in part because of its intense authenticity to being young in the late 90s, and the language and the vocabulary, and also just the kind of like incredibly anxiety inducing internal competitions of like that middle school age. There's this Hulu show that I think most people know about, Pen 15, that takes place. It's two comedians who are playing themselves in 2001 who are exactly my age. So they're in seventh grade, the exact year I was in seventh grade. And it's like watching my nightmare because of how accurate it is. And unlike that, which is accurate and to comedic effect, there's an accuracy here to sort of like intense literary effect that has sort of shook me. And that's also present in the 1997 chapters that take place in Ann Arbor and Detroit. But you channel this lexicon and the sort of overall aura of late 90s adolescence, from young girlhood through to like an 18-year-old boy in Caleb. And I'm just wondering, not to do like asking a magician to reveal their tricks thing, but what is involved in channeling that interiority? Like, is it just as simple as opening up a tap on your memory and kind of revisiting that stuff? It just felt like reviving like a lost codex of the way we used to talk to each other, how the disgusting things we shared, all the sort of rumors about sex and sexuality, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I will say that the anecdote that the opening narrative grew out of was it was shared with me anecdotally, but it was a real experience that someone I knew had, where she met someone in a chat room and she and her best friend got on a train and went to visit this stranger. And you know, things didn't turn out as planned. And so without like, you know, talking about that too much, I remember her sharing that with me, and she's about my age as well, like late 30s. And I remember her sharing that with me and just being sort of like awed and like, wow, that sounds so brave and dramatic. And I can't imagine ever having done anything like that as a 13-year-old. And I was interested in the story. And so I started writing it as like kind of a piece of flash fiction and just kind of playing with it a little bit. And then like over time, it was funny because it tripped something for me in my memory, where I started like remembering episodes from my own adolescence where in fact I did behave in as risky of a way. And I was like remembering a time in high school when my best friend and I just decided like to take her mom's car without asking her and drive like 8 hours to visit her brother at college. And we thought that that was like a totally acceptable thing to do. I think we were 16 and had like just gotten our driver's licenses. But so all that is to say is like, yeah, it was funny how it sort of took like the story from another person and me kind of listening to that and thinking about it to like open up these personal memories for myself, which started to inform more of not so much the plot of the novel, but definitely like the voices and, like you said, John, like the kind of lexicon and even down to the music that the girls are listening to, the way that they're interacting, the way that there's like this constant sort of what they're saying is not what they're thinking and feeling. And there's this like constant disconnect between how they're trying to present and what they're going through internally, and this like really like kind of anxiety inducing desire to perform a kind of self that maybe they're not, that, you know, that's only aspirational or that's not there yet. And then also at an early point in writing, I discovered my own diary from when I was 13. Which was a document that I had completely forgotten existed at all. And I was cleaning some things out and found it at my parents' house. And reading it was enlightening and a little bit shocking to at times, just the level of kind of the articulation of certain experiences and then the complete glossing over of other experiences, which I think we often find when we're revisiting diaries. You know, something like really consequential that happens is given this like, like very like glancing treatment, and then something that feels so minor is like described in detail.
Yeah.
So yeah, those were some of the kind of origins of like the voice and the story that opens the book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really fascinating. And leads me to my next question, which is about diaries and diarying. Um, uh, Cassie, who Judy and Megan are going to see, has left the care of her aunt to try to track down her mother, her birth mother, and has left her own diary, which she fastidiously keeps behind. And while they're sort of briefly imprisoned by a kind of unaware aunt, they discover this diary. And you wrote recently a piece in LitHub about losing your own diary as an adult, and not so much a diary as like a diary and a notebook, and just sort of like one's writing, ideas, all sorts of things, and having it returned to you by someone who both found it, read it, and then wrote to you about it. I'm actually going to put a link in the chat to the LitHub piece if you'd like to read it later. You write, the kind of critique letter I always wished from my workshop mates was the sort of letter she wrote you, brimming with praise and understanding. And then you write, I was cautiously flattered, but mostly totally spooked. She had pulled back the curtain on both my deepest feelings and my writing process, had witnessed my haphazard formula for turning life into art, one that even I didn't understand. What if, having been discovered, it no longer worked? What if the person who wrote you the letter about your diary was in my apartment now, invisible over my shoulder as I compose sentences? I often feel when I'm like interviewing authors or talking to authors, or the whole process of an author interview is like an unfair attempt to try to bring out the mystery of writing from them, talk about something that is a very spooky and often sort of process of discovery, not less an intentional process. More, the intention is just to write into an idea. But it strikes me that who you might be as the title of this novel is at once both like an unsettling realization that characters in this book have, or fight against, in Caleb's case, of thinking about who you might be as sort of like, I might be the kind of person that, finished the sentence, and then having to reckon with that. But also a recognition of the self as very unstable and unsettled and unresolved and unknowable. And a diary plays into that in this way, in that the passages are written by people. Anyone's diary. I mean, if I was revisiting my diary, I'd say this: I don't recognize the person in these pages because, maybe brutally, I don't remember writing that diary entry, and I don't remember the event that I'm detailing. But it's also that if people were to see it or recognize us when reading it, we don't know, as you write in this piece, like, it really is us. That's truly like our most intimate secrets. But having someone else read your diary is so invasive because it's almost as if it's not you. It's not a real representation of you at all. It's not something you want to share with somebody else. It's like this weird partition part. And it becomes this central part of the novel because what Megan and Judy read in Cassie's diary has repercussions into 2016 in the third section of the novel. And I was just curious to know what the process is like of writing about oneself. Because this is, as you say, like, there are pieces of your life here, but it's not like an auto-fictional novel in any sense of the word. And so I'm curious what it's like to sort of be removed from a kind of very in vogue writing practice to like write about oneself as a process of examining writing, to write about characters who are discovering this sort of slippery multiplicity of selfhood. Again, one of my very pet too long questions. Sorry.
I mean, first of all, I just want to say that thank you for such a thoughtful reading, because so many of the things that you're describing are just very much what I hoped a reader would recognize. Yeah, I feel like I first person is an uncomfortable point of view for me to typically write in. When I'm writing in the first person, I'm never sure like who that voice is always very mysterious and nebulous to me, especially if I'm trying to write fiction in the first person. I love reading autofiction, but I'm very admiring of writers who can do that. I don't think that I could successfully do that. I think of like Cindy Sherman and like the film stills pieces, and I think of like so much of what excites me and what I find liberating about art and making art and writing fiction in particular is this bizarre exercise of stepping into another person's consciousness. And because that person is invented by me and by my own consciousness, right, there's always going to be this way in which that is the writer as well, right? Like that is the author. Yeah, so I don't know if I have like a super comprehensive response. I feel like you articulated so much about the book that's important to me, in terms of like the way in which self is this constantly shifting thing, and that in some ways I think the process of trying to define that and investigating that over the course of one's life, like that's its own definition of self to me.
Yeah.
It's not fixed, and that embarrassment that you feel when you go back and read that old diary, like you hit the nail on the head. It's that paradox of this is so me, but this is also unrecognizable to me. Therefore, how can it be me?
Yeah.
And it just like really emphasizes and reiterates that feeling of like regeneration of cells, and like you are a different person in a different moment, you know? And I think like so much of that has to do with what's happening externally and what we're perceiving and what we're sensing. And the title was important to me here, in that it can be read in those two ways, as both a reflexive question and a question to another person.
Right.
Who are you that I'm looking at, and also who might I be? Who am I inside here?
Right.
You know, like,
yeah. No, well, talking about first person and third person, and I'm just still thinking about so much. I guess before I get to that, something you're saying makes me think of, you mentioned in another interview that you often find in the process of writing, or one finds in the process of writing, that you go into these things you go into a piece with maybe an idea, something you want to explore, something that sort of starts the process off. But in the process of writing, something about a character's arc or the plot sort of transcends anything that you were writing into. And, you know, again, this is sort of like one of these like show us your hand kind of questions. But like, I am curious to know if the diary stuff seems so essential to the novel. And I'm wondering if that was, you know, what the building blocks of the novel were, because the way it kind of unfurls and some of the plot sort of garden paths that maybe like, you know, don't resolve, so to speak, but are so mind bending and really deeply fleshed out and felt on the page. They seem to me that kind of like trace themselves back to that kind of core thing about some kind of mystery of selfhood, as instantiated by like artistic practice, or like, I don't know, again, I think of like a diary as like a proto-artistic practice, because in the second section you have graffiti, which Miles and Caleb are discovering to different ends. Caleb for status and for some way to kind of live out the person he thinks he should be, as kind of like someone who's not yet gone to college, who's obstinate, who's sort of like wants to sort of be the black sheep. I don't know, obsessed with being like a heterodox figure within his own family. And then Miles, who does it in this incredibly devotional way of like love and the practice itself. So yeah, I'm curious to know, like, you know, if the germ of the book was, you know, that kind of like a diary itself, or like perhaps it just like you said, this initial piece sort of flowed from a flash fiction piece. But if that was like maybe as you were building this kind of the spine you saw appearing in the possibility of a novel, it's like that central thing.
Yeah, the diary, the discovery of the diary came late in the early drafting process of that section. It sort of unlocked something for me when I knew that like I had these girls and this like relational dynamic between them in this room, and it was sort of like almost building this suspense and kind of building this like atmospherically tense situation. And I didn't know like where it was going or what would be revealed or what the point of it was. And I kind of hit on the diary as like a device or an idea. And the early entries that I was writing in Cassie's voice were really bad and like not, I found it very hard to like write from the point of view of this character. And you know, not to spoil too much, but she reveals some really traumatic things
Right.
in the diary. And so figuring out a way to write about those that would feel authentic was hard. And it's sort of a cliche, but I think that old creative writing workshop craft class advice of like writing at the edge of your ability is really useful. And that's like advice that I think about a lot and I try to take seriously. And I think in a process sense, it served me very well in that it's like, when there is a challenge in creating something, like confronting that and pushing through that and trying to work through that, even if it means lots of rewrites and lots of frustration and thinking and, you know, returning to the other source, you know, returning to your bookshelf of like the people that you go to read, to feel capable and inspired again in your own work, is all super helpful. And yeah, so I think once I started to feel more confident in the way that I was writing the entries, they felt very powerful to me. And then like to sort of to answer your question, or to get into the question about diary writing as a kind of proto art, and then there are these echoes of art practices and art making and art pieces that kind of echo through the book.
Yeah.
I don't have like a tidy answer for that, but I think that I knew I had wanted to write about graffiti for a really long time, and I didn't know how. I didn't know how to approach it in a way that didn't feel trite or precious or annoying or something. And yeah, so the more that I like kind of worked on that problem in like sort of a different realm, I just started to feel like these narratives were connected, and I started to see this like connective tissue between them. And so the building of the novel like happened over the course of years, but during those years, a lot of the work was quite compartmentalized in that I thought it was part of the world and of the same world, but I didn't really know how. And figuring out like the solution to how these things could work together in a way that felt interesting to me and exciting to me as the writer, that was really fun and also frustrating, and you know took a lot of like mental work to try to get there. But yeah, does that
yeah, absolutely. That helps me. I mean, you know, it's just like this kind of like behind the scenes stuff that I guess I crave reading the novel. But I think, yeah, it was so interesting to notice this through line of in this first section of these two young girls discovering this diary and thinking about diary as a kind of, I mean, it's sort of essential to Cassie when she arrives at her mother's compound, so to speak. She's sort of distraught that she doesn't have this way of cataloging things, which is like a way of processing or understanding, right? Which is all an artistic practice ultimately ends up being, less, if not the self, then at least ideas that relate to the self. And then the stuff about graffiti is just so beautiful and so crackling with similar ideas about, I kept thinking about like the logos, like the, graffiti is like developing this moniker and it has this charge, like not just seeing it repeated, but like what it means, the acronym of your crew name, how it can be sort of malleable, like two initials can stand for three different phrases that are sort of thematically linked. And all that stuff is about like meaning making. And then it's so, again, I don't want to give anything away, but in the third section, it's confronted with what I think is kind of like a vacant and like too practiced form of art. That is that the characters who recur from those first two sections are now sort of caught in a kind of self-referential, mindless, lassitudinal kind of form of art that maybe we're like trapped in now or something like that. As compared to sort of the directness of like these pre-artistic forms of like diary writing as a child, and then this very specific cultural phenomenon and artistic practice of graffiti, which also has all of these like, cultural elements, social elements about like, crews beefing and there's a lot of masculinity involved in that as well. So yeah, I could see that there are so many backbones to this novel. I mean, parenting, trauma are incredibly intertwined in these characters' lives. But what I think said to you before we went live was like, I felt like there was this subterranean thread of art. And it was interesting to read a novel about art and making art, or not about, but that involved the artistic practice so acutely, that was not an autofictional work. That was not someone commenting self-referentially on the practice. And I think that opened up really fascinating avenues. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about too was the structure of the novel is really fascinating in having this kind of like dialectic of like two sections that are then synthesized. But you've mentioned it too as like a shaggy novel, I think, and I found that term really funny because I feel like it's still like a really airtight book, even if there are characters that don't reappear. And I think that gives it power, that there are just these threads and that readers will find in both sections that trail off, that do not return in the third section. Again, I'm not going to spoil it. I'll tell you who's in the third section and who's not of the people I've mentioned, but I'm curious about that too. There seem to be like a million permutations of ways the characters in the first and second section could cross paths in New York, a city where everyone's social circle interacts somehow. And it could just be glancing blows, or it could be super involved. But I was really surprised by who reappeared and why. And I'm curious to know what the process of like was. I mean, it sounds like maybe the way the novel was drafted was these two sections becoming clearly of the same piece, and then perhaps the synthesis was approached last. But if that's the case, I'm really curious to know, if there was just like, oh, this is it, or if there were. I mean, for me, like a reader, you just want to like, oh, you think about, like, you hypothesize, like, what if so-and-so had returned and not so-and-so, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm monologuing.
No, I love it. You're doing the hard work. um, I mean, yeah, the characters that do appear in the third section, I think, are maybe not exactly the characters that people would have expected. I that was those were intuitive. That was a very intuitive choice for me. It wasn't enormously conceptual, although the more that I worked on that section, it felt it began to feel more right the more I discovered what that narrative was and what that story was sort of about. I mean, the third section, without spoiling much, is it's very much becomes more about like how we cope with the past and how we
Right.
process what's happened to us or what we've experienced or people that we've encountered along the way. And so, yeah, that character or that section involves characters who are older, right? They're not teenagers. It involves one of the main characters' mothers, and I liked this idea of like moving everything forward in time in a slightly dramatic way, not just by the 20-year gap that elapses when the third section opens in New York, but also in the fact that we have these older characters who are in like middle age or late middle age. Just that it gives that like feeling of like I think that it puts more emphasis on the desire and the need to like have figured some things out or to have made peace with some things in the past. And that actually doesn't really happen.
Right.
But again, that felt like really fertile to me in that, like that self is still being made, and that those we are still creating and constructing those narratives about who we are and what we've been through and what the future holds, even when we're older, right? Even when we're older than myself. And it was a fun imaginative exercise for me to think about like, how will I think about my own childhood when I'm in my 60s, or how do my parents think about what they've been through, or like this sort of exercise in like what reflection could be like in the future, which is not something that I think we normally are thinking about. We're thinking about like, where will I be when I like, in a more material sense, like what will that future look like? So that was maybe like some of the rationale behind some of the characters that were chosen, that I chose to kind of return. I was really, there were a couple of novels that were very formally inspiring for me during the writing of this book. The first is a novel by Tessa Hadley called The Past. Have you read that? I highly recommend it to anyone out there. But it's a 3-part novel, and it involves a first section and a third section that are set in the present. The point of view weaves through multiple different characters who are all part of this family. And then the middle section is this kind of like interesting disjointed set piece that involves those characters' parents, like 30 years before. And so it's just I just like found it to be like a fascinating book on like both a formal level and a psychological level. And then the other novel that was really instructive is called A Life to Come, and the writer is Michelle de Kretzer. She's an Australian writer. She's not widely read in the US, but it's also it's a book that moves through many different characters and many different stories. And it has a beautiful cumulative effect, but it's throwing you a lot of curveballs and surprises.
I can see how those touch on the form of who you might be. I mean, the thing that I was most attracted to, like, I can't do this without saying like spoiling this novel for people, but like I were the characters who have deeply fleshed out moments in the plot, arresting, like page turning, suspenseful moments, and then the story closes, and you sort of know. I think as you're reading, and the form sort of takes effect on you as a reader, you know that you're hurtling towards a third section where only some of these characters will come back, and I thought like it must be hard to like write these, not sort of like cliffhangers, but write these irresolute moments of these characters and not see them return. Or I mean, there's one character in particular who I think just sort of haunts the novel in their absence. um uh, and that was really affecting to me. And I think this sort of coalesces with another question I had, which is you mentioned like not writing in the first person. I mean, the novel employs the close third in this really fascinating way too, where sometimes perspective shifts between the interiority of one character or another to sort of build suspense, or throw us curveballs as a reader, or really inventively, especially in the second section, play with time through sort of flashback or something like that. But I was just sort of curious about how that sort of functions in a knowing in the novel you're composing, where you know that these things will be left behind. It's sort of liberating to sort of be able to. I think the form. I appreciate the form because my favorite novels are novels where, I think of a towering novel like 2666, where it's just a series of like improbable, scary, frightening, investigative narratives they're just dispensed with, and then on to the next one, and you seem like you're building towards something, and then sort of that you're not is such a important experience of reading the novel. But yeah, I'm curious about like writing into a work where the shagginess or whatever is there, like what kind of freedoms it afforded you, and if it's something that you would want to return to.
Yeah, it's not something I'll return to anytime soon. I think it can be, yeah, I think you can have a lot of fun with it. I think it can also create challenges because, at the same time, you want to be generous to your readers, and you want to, you don't want to, it's like you can throw the curveball, but it needs to be maybe gentle, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of like delightful surprise as opposed to like the disappointing surprise, I think is a hard thing to modulate. It's like I'm only one reader of my work, so that can be tricky to try to figure out. But yeah, ultimately I think those characters who are left behind, it was really important to me that if they don't return physically in the book, that they do have a kind of, that they haunt those future pages, or
Right.
that their presence resonates, and that they have maybe these like very small ripple effects, but they are still affecting the characters who do appear later in the book. One of the characters, you find out later that this character is a writer, and
Right.
is in some ways is keeping alive like her memory of certain childhood events through writing about them, even though that writing is fictional, and even though that writing is not necessarily like it's speculative, and it's extrapolating
Right.
on things that happened. But yeah, I mean, it's I think like we can be just as haunted and just affected by very, very brief encounters as we are by long
Yeah.
relationships with
Yeah.
people that we're very close with. And that's fascinating to me, like why you have a dream about the person that you sat next to in seventh grade that you haven't thought
Yeah.
about in years. Like, where is that experience like residing in your consciousness, and how does that affect you, and how does that inform you?
Yeah.
So yeah, does that kind of
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's when you read the novel, if you've yet to read it, I think this stuff will crystallize for you as a reader. I wanted to ask maybe really briefly, we have time for questions. So if anyone has questions, I don't want to be susceptible to any more monologuing, but please feel free to submit them in the chat box. We have a few more minutes here, but I just want to maybe touch on place too. I mean, I'm sitting in fake Ann Arbor behind me, but still in real Ann Arbor and in my home, and Ann Arbor's features in the novel, as well as Detroit and California, where you grew up, and of course New York City. And I'm curious to know, for you writing this novel, I mean, questions about place to authors are asked a lot, like, oh, then the place becomes a character in a book, say. But there are these really, I mean, just really loving, and knowing as someone who grew up and still lives in Ann Arbor, depictions of what life is like here, especially to people who are coming from larger cities. The sort of like social hellscape sweatiness of New York City is well captured. And I'm just curious to know, like, how you come to setting, what's important to you in crafting a novel about the way a place is depicted. Obviously Detroit has, there's a lot of anxiety about the way outsiders might depict Detroit, and I think that what's so wonderful about how it's depicted in Who You Might Be is that it's a source of incredible love and affection for the characters who discover it, and who discover how to make art within it. But yeah, just like, obviously these are all places you've lived in too. And so I'm curious to just know how place affects, I guess, like emotion too, because I feel like physical spaces create kind of ideas in us. I think I just described New York in a way that probably reflects my own experience of visiting, but yeah.
Yeah, place is super, super important to me. I think in writing, it's nearly impossible for me to imagine anything in a fictive sense without seeing where it's set. And those settings, those places, like they're often places that I'm missing in a particular moment, or thinking about for some reason. And I think once a place becomes alive on the page, it feels easier for me to access what's going on in that place, right? Like what the action is, what the characters are going through. The places in the book, I kind of did the thing where I wrote about those places from different places, and that was helpful. I think I felt a lot of nostalgia and a lot of yearning for many of the places in the book while I was writing it. A big portion, the first complete draft of the book I wrote in New Mexico while I was at a residency, and it was a residency that was it was 3 months long, and it was quite isolating, in that there was no internet, and you lived alone, and you didn't share communal meals. Which was incredible for work and for like going deep with the work, but certainly had this effect of making me miss a lot of things and a lot of people. Yeah. And I had just left New York to move back to Detroit when I was doing that residency. So I was thinking about New York a lot. I was thinking about Detroit a lot. I feel like I'm always thinking about California. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's sort of an excuse, right, to revisit these places in your imagination when you can work them into your writing. And I mean, I find that if I'm trying to write about a place that I've never been, it never goes well, and I usually have to leave that behind. But
easier to, so I guess you're saying easier to access access setting through memory than to be
Exactly.
living in the space that
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
in a weird way. It's sort of the same diary thing. Like
Yeah.
you can't be there, can't recognize it to experience it or something like that.
Sure.
Well, I think we're almost out of time. I maybe have one more question for you. Um, these characters have really stuck with me since reading the novel, and accompanied me on my walks around my neighborhood at night, and I've thought about them in through all sorts of weird lenses, like through uh, revisiting my latent Buddhist practice and meditation and stuff like that, and thinking about the five divine messengers and all sorts of weird stuff. Um, but I mean, obviously, you're writing a novel. We sort of talked about it in so many ways, where you're encountering self and selfhood. You're trying to capture this kind of slipperiness of the choices we made, the repercussions that those choices make, which factors largely in this novel. We didn't even get a chance to touch on that. There's all sorts of things about forgiveness and atonement and trauma here as well, and the irresoluteness is important because I feel irresolute in how I feel about all of it. Other than that, I keep thinking about it. But I'm wondering, for you as an author, maybe too deep of a last question, but if there's things that surprised you coming away from writing this, when you're writing into these ideas, um, maybe there are new problems, but sort of, I know how these characters affect me, and I'm wondering if you found that they affected you in a way that was different from when you were exploring them or thinking of them as disparate, unconnected in the early stages.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were certainly surprises all along the way, and revelations. And I think that's so much of, I mean, that is that's the stuff that keeps you going in writing, because that's what continues to attract and to feel evocative and to feel like, okay, I can like continue working on this project.
Mm-hmm.
There's more to be discovered. There's more to see and to be surprised by. I think one of the things that did surprise me was this. There are lots of traumas in the book, for lack of a better word. That's kind of a blanket statement, but there are lots of difficult experiences that the characters go through.
Right.
And one thing that surprised me was that I found some of the characters by the third section, when they're looking back on their lives and kind of doing some of that reflection 20 years in the future, I think I found them still clinging even to those memories, and to, kind of like clinging to the parts of your past, even though you know that maybe those parts weren't healthy or weren't as good as they should have been. That kind of comes out in some of the relationships at the end, and in the way that the characters think about what's happened to them. And that surprised me in a way that I just had never like fully thought about before. And I think that that's actually a very human response, to protect what's yours, even if you wish it had been different.
Yeah, and I think the characters too, at least the ones that we find in the third section, they there is some sort of acceptance, and it comes in a really real and earned way. For those who can reach acceptance, I think there's some characters who cannot, who have sort of lost themselves. But for the ones who, I guess, matter, and it becomes clear, there is some really fascinating ways that those characters are kept authentic to themselves and are given space to process the things that haunt us, which this novel is also exploring in a profound way. So that just leaves me to say thank you for writing this beautiful novel. To our viewers, oops, that's the back of it. It's upside down now. You can't even see it because of the virtual background. Please purchase Who You Might Be. There's a link in the chat. There's a link below me if you're watching on YouTube. Leigh, I want to talk to you for another hour about stuff, but I have to let everyone go eat dinner. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope we can have you in the bookstore for your next book in a not too distant future. But thank you so much for joining us tonight on At Home with Literati.
You too. Thank you.
To all of our viewers, thanks so much. We'll see you at the next event. Take care all.